anesthesiologist. I never take a patient back to surgery until I've had a chance to talk to them in the preoperative area. And one of the things I do is I give them a chance to ask me questions. And most of them have very routine questions. But a certain percentage of them have a very specific fear. They say to me, "Doc, after you put me out, is there any chance that I'm going to wake up during surgery and feel the surgeon cutting into me? Or, Doc, once the surgery is over, is there any chance that I'm never going to wake up again?" What these people recognize deep in their gut is that as their anesthesiologist, I'm going to manipulate their consciousness. In fact, the major target of anesthetic drugs is your brain, making you blissfully unaware of the surgeon's knife. These drugs bind to receptors in your brain, and they cause your consciousness to reversibly dissolve away. When surgery is done, we wash these drugs out of your brain and watch consciousness reassemble itself. In fact, we are privileged to have a ringside seat to this most stunning of mysteries. So I decided, I'd like to actually watch this happening in real time. Can I do this? And so what I decided to do is put a set of electrodes on my patients' foreheads so that I could map an EEG or an electroencephalogram and actually watch their states of consciousness change. And in this way, in the operating room, I can actually watch somebody move from being completely awake to losing an awareness of all the noxious and terrifying stimuli coming at them from the real world. Now, watching brains dissolve and reassemble themselves like this has given us some really interesting insights. For one, it allows us to distinguish what makes a conscious brain different from an unconscious one. But it doesn't answer the million-dollar question, and that is, where does consciousness arise from? Does it simply emerge from this complicated set of networks that we call the brain? And if that's true, is the corollary true? That if we could build an artificial simulation of the brain, every single nerve cell, every connection between those nerve cells, would we have an artificial construct that would express consciousness? Now, many modern neuroscientists believe that's true. In fact, many scientists believe that's true. But this evening, I'm going to introduce you to a heretical idea. What if the brain doesn't produce consciousness? What if consciousness were something available to it in the physical universe? What if consciousness were information that an organic brain could bind to, could receive, could filter and process, and turn into something useful for the organism's survival? So I'm going to give you an analogy because that's kind of a difficult concept to get your mind around. We're going to use the visual system as an analogy. So our visual system is designed, it's structured to pull in information from the electromagnetic spectrum. But we don't see the entire electromagnetic spectrum. In fact, our color vision is limited by the 3 color receptors and their absorption range in our eye. And as a result, we see a rainbow going from red to the violet. Now, there are many animals like this beautiful mantis shrimp that lives on the coral reef that have many more color receptors than a human does. This guy has 12 or more color receptors for our 3. And as a result, what it sees is a rainbow that actually moves from deep in the red all the way to the ultraviolet. In other words, the mantis shrimp sees a much wider rainbow than a human does. Now, once that's done, that's not the end. Our eye pulls in information from the electromagnetic spectrum, but it continues to process it, run calculations on it. Some of that information is even thrown out. And by the time it gets to the back of our head, to the visual cortex, it's an impoverished version of what was originally available to us out in the real world. In other words, our brain has just created a visual illusion, a construct, if you will. But that construct allows us to survive in our habitat, and incredibly successfully. And so what would we say? We would say that the brain processes visual information, but it doesn't produce it. The brain processes information. It doesn't produce it. Our visual perception actually begins in the world and ends in our mind. Now, let's look at this from a different perspective. Let's look at it in terms of information. If we were to consider the fact that the universe contains an enormous amount of information, in fact, there is a physicist who tried to estimate that. His name is Seth Lloyd. He was from MIT, and he came up with an estimate of 10 to the 90th bits. Now, whether that estimate is exactly accurate is less important than the fact that it's an incredibly large number. It's actually very hard for us to comprehend 10 to the 90th bits. And there is no organic brain that could bind to all 10 to the 90th bits in the universe. It's too metabolically expensive, it would take too much energy, and that brain would just burn out. But we could imagine a more limited set of networks that would pull in a more limited set of information that would allow us to survive, and in the process, produce the electrical signature that we already observe and measure, the EEG. And in fact, this process sounds a lot like what the visual system does, but just at a much grander scale. So I'm going to bring you back to that heretical idea. What if consciousness were not something produced by the brain? What if consciousness referred to the information that a brain could access in the universe in order to enable its survival? What if your brain were simply one large information receptor and processor? How would that change your understanding of what it meant to be conscious? Now I'm going to take you back to anesthesia for a moment to help us understand something else. Anesthetics at clinically relevant doses, that means if I give you a drug and make you unconscious on an operating room table, if I give you that dose of drugs, it doesn't abolish the electrical activity in your brain. In other words, your brain doesn't appear to be brain dead. But those anesthetics do something very, very interesting. What they do is they actually decrease the ability for the brain to calculate information. And they do one other thing. They actually cause functional networks within the brain to break down. And they not only dissolve networks within the brain, but between networks as well. So what do you have under anesthetics? A decrease in the ability to calculate information and a decrease in functional connectivity. In other words, anesthetics actually rewire the filter that is your brain. And that teaches us something very interesting about the fundamental nature of consciousness, and it allows us to now ask some difficult questions. Let's go back to that original question. What would happen if we created an artificial simulation of the brain? Would it express consciousness? Now, according to what I just told you, if we created a sufficiently complex set of artificial networks, it might very well do that. Not because it possesses some ineffable quality, but because it now had access to a universe of information not previously available to it. And then the big question, what happens when a biological organism dies? Does its consciousness die with it? Or does it persist as information, much like the visual spectrum outlasts the visual system that perceives it? And if that's true, if consciousness persists as processed information, is it non-local? That means, can you move it around? Could you move it from body to body, or body to computer, or avatar to avatar? Could you copy it because it's information after all? My patients often wonder, when I anesthetize them, where does their consciousness go? Well, it might very well be that when I anesthetize you, I actually am simply rewiring the network, that is your brain, rewiring the filter, and maybe partially taking it out of the way. And it's entirely possible that when you are unconscious, you have access to more information than you do when you're awake. It's just that you don't explicitly remember it. And that's because anesthetics abolish explicit recall. Our perception of color begins in the world and ends in our mind. Our consciousness might also begin in the world and end in our mind. And what makes human consciousness appear to be so special is that the way it ends in the mind of a human is very different than the way it ends in the mind of a mantis shrimp. Merci.